Okay, class, now we are going to look at one of my favorite reading strategies, and that is highlighting and annotating. And one thing that I want to make a point of and stress is that you have to move beyond just highlighting only. Sometimes when we're highlighting, we can get in the autopilot mode, and before we know it, our entire page is highlighted in lots of different colors, but we really don't know what that means. So we want to incorporate annotating with our highlighting, because what that does is it forces your mind to move to developing words into thoughts. And it takes your mind to another level of thinking. And so putting that down on the piece of paper in words and thoughts through the annotation will help you retain the information. And so what I want to do, what I have on the screen is some information for you about highlighting and annotating. And so let's just look at that. In college, when you're reading your textbook, you want to be looking for possible test questions. So if you come across something that you think an instructor might ask on a test, highlight that information. Statistics are always good to highlight because more than likely you will have a question about a statistic that you've read. Also, key terms related to what you're talking about. If you're in a psychology class and they've talked about different theories, you might highlight those key terms, highlight those theory names as your key terms. And then you also want to highlight main ideas that you read. Now, this is just a suggestion. You're not tied to these colors, but you might think about using yellow to highlight main ideas, pink to highlight details, maybe key terms, and then green to highlight examples. A couple of notes to think about highlighting is highlight no more than 3 words in a row. Okay, we're not going to be highlighting full sentences or paragraphs. And then try to keep a maximum of 1/3 of the page should be highlighted. So you don't want the whole page highlighted because then it just becomes a bunch of color and you're not really able to differentiate what you're looking for when you're reading. So after you highlight a text, let's look at some ways that we can annotate, make notes about the information. So a couple of things you can do. You can take your pencil and circle unfamiliar words and then write the definition in the margin. I have a book I'm currently reading right now, and it's a technical book, and so there are some terms in there that I don't know. And so when I'm reading, I'll circle a word, and then I go to the dictionary and I look up the word and I write the definition in the margin. So circle unfamiliar words. Use the pound sign if the article or chapter list or steps in a process. So if you're reading an article and it says step 1, step 2, put the pound sign there and write number 1, number 2, or step 1, step 2. That might help you keep that in order. And typically those will be test questions. If you come across a confusing statement, you've read something, it's a sentence or two, and you're not sure what that means, put a question mark out in the margin next to that statement. You can summarize in the margin. If you've read something and it's a lengthy paragraph explaining something, out in the margin, you might just write a few words that summarize what you've read. Then looking at the text, you've read a statement and you think, you know what? I don't know if I agree with that or not. Well, out in the margin, write agree, write the word disagree. You can go back and then explain why you agree or disagree with that. And then if you read something that triggers the thought, I need to do some more investigation on that. I have more questions about what I just read. You might put a little asterisk beside that particular topic or the sentences that you've read for further questions. So keeping this in mind and how we're going to annotate, let's look at this text that I have available for you about Robert Atkins. And so what I'm going to do is I want to pause for just a moment. You can pause the video. I want you to read these 3 paragraphs and use some of these annotation techniques, and then we'll go over them as a class. So go ahead and pause the video and take just a few moments to read that. Okay, I hope you enjoyed reading that article. Let's look first at our technique of circling unfamiliar words. So as I read this article, the first thing that stands out is his name, Atkins. Okay, sometimes we may have heard that as Adkins, A-D-K-I-N-S, but his name is really A-T-K-I-N-S. So I'm going to circle that T so that I know if I'm answering questions or writing about this in a report that I'm going to spell his name correctly. So reading through here, were there any other words that maybe you were unfamiliar with? Sometimes when students have read this in the past, the word illustrious was an unfamiliar word. So that could mean notable, famous. He had a famous career. So reading through here, was there another word that we might be unfamiliar with? Well, sometimes we're unfamiliar with the word succumbed. Just what does succumbed mean? It says he succumbed to his injury. I like to think about that as he fell victim to, or it was a result of his injury is what succumbed would mean. So I could circle those words and then look them up and then make a note in the margin as to what these particular unfamiliar words meant. So let's look now at our next method of annotation, and that is looking for steps or a process. So in reading this article, did you read anywhere in here that something that could have been the steps or a process? Well, here in paragraph 2, he recommended eliminating all carbohydrates from the diet and consuming mostly proteins. So that's step number 1. I would put the pound sign here with number 1. And consuming mostly proteins, step number 2. So I would put the pound sign and a number 2 there. So next, I want to look for confusing statements. So I'm going to put question marks next to anything that might be a confusing statement. Well, it says that his controversial diet caused panic. And I'm thinking, why is it controversial? And so as I get to looking at this, I might want to put a question mark there and say, well, why was it controversial? But as I look further, I see it was the food manufacturers who were afraid of it hitting their industry and making them take a reduction of money that they were making because of the diet. So again, I could summarize that in the margin. Next, we could look at placing an asterisk by any statements where we had further questions. And so as I'm reading this article, it talked about something that I questioned. Some critics argued that his accident may have been connected to his being overweight. And I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. This is a cardiologist famous for a healthy diet. Why was he overweight when he died? So I would put an asterisk here, and that might make me think I want to investigate that further. So at this point, what I would like to do is for you to pause the video and open a browser and go to Google and search Robert Atkins' death. And there are some articles that are the first in the feed that you can look at and read those, and then let's come back and discuss about his death. Okay, so there were a couple of articles that I found that I read about Robert Atkins' death. And when you read those articles, you find out that he had fallen and hit his head. And that is why he was admitted to the hospital, was initially because of the fall and the head injury. And it talked about when he entered the hospital, 6 feet tall, 195 pounds. Maybe not what we would consider obese. The articles went on to talk about that while he was in the hospital, he gained over 60 pounds. And so at the time of his death, he was over 200 pounds. And there was a doctor who was jealous of Atkins' work and made the statement that it was because he had succumbed to his death from being overweight, when in actuality, it was the fall that resulted in him being in the hospital. So keep that in mind when you're reading. If you see something that you have questions about, look for additional sources of information to verify that what you've just read is true, or to further expound upon that information. So I hope you see how you can use the annotation steps to read through an article. And now that we've done that, let's see if we can answer some questions about this article that we've just read. So if this was an assignment in a class and you had been asked to read this and then answer these questions, you've read it, you've annotated it with the little strategies that we've shown you, and so now you're asked, who was Robert Atkins? Well, from reading this article, you could say he was an American cardiologist who invented a popular and controversial diet known as the Atkins diet. Okay, question number 2. What were the 2 main points of his diet plan? Well, if you'll remember, we used the technique of the pound sign in listing the steps in a process. And so his 2 steps, as I go back and look at this, it was eliminating carbohydrates and consuming mostly proteins. Okay, so that would be answer number 2. Question number 3, why was his plan controversial? Well, we remember in that second paragraph, we had a confusing statement about it being controversial. We had identified that with our question mark. Well, it was controversial because it was affecting food manufacturers, especially food manufacturers who processed foods high in carbohydrates. So that's why it was controversial. Let's look at question number 4. Why would so many people put so much faith in a dietary concept created by one person? Well, as we read this article, there are two reasons that could happen. The first one is because it talks about him being an American cardiologist, talks about where he received his degree. And so we think about a cardiologist working with your heart health. They're an expert in the field, so they should be qualified to talk about a heart-healthy diet. Also, there were so many people having success with this diet plan, and they were losing weight. So that is why so many people would have faith in this diet. And question number 5. Do you agree with the critics that Dr. Atkins' premature death was caused by obesity? Well, I think most of us, after we had that one sentence that made us want to ask additional questions, I think we might agree that obesity was not the cause of his death. It was the fall and the hit on the head that landed him in the hospital. And so I hope that through this process that you've realized now that you have some skills that you can use with your textbook reading, even if you're just reading for leisure. I do this a lot with my books that I read for leisure. So just remember these highlighting and annotation steps and use these strategies to help you be successful in your reading endeavors. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me.